Welcome to On the Mark. I'm your host, Howard Mark Rubin. I am so excited to present this podcast series addressing our rapidly changing world and how it is affecting industries and people in unique and interesting ways. As John F. Kennedy once said, change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. The business leaders and personalities who I will be interviewing in these podcasts certainly look to the future. And I hope you come away with information and inspiration that helps you adapt in both your business and personal lives. You can find these podcasts on all major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, getsplatzer.com. Welcome to On the Mark. We have a very special show today. We have Rabbi Steven Weil, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Friends of Israel Defense Forces. This is an organization that's become very close to me, and I have a strong feeling for it. Before the events of October 7th, I used to support Jewish charities, not necessarily Israeli-based charities. But after October 11th, I felt the need to do something as a Jew to help the people who were suffering in Israel, who were thrown into this war, not of their own doing, but because of events that were outside their control, and how it affected these people, these soldiers. It's one of the few countries that has a totally voluntary, mandatory army. They don't have a choice about going into the army. The reserves are regular citizens, and these people have suffered tremendously. And when I looked and saw what was the best organization for American Jew to help those people, I came up with the Friends of Israel Defense Forces. And today we have Rabbi Steven Weil, who's their executive director. Welcome, Rabbi Weil. How are you today?
Howard, it's an honor to be on the program, really. And I know this, that we know many people who follow weekly the podcast, and we're very grateful for what you're doing.
Yes. Well, let's talk about how you first came to the Friends of Israel Defense Forces. So wasn't it an easy time? You came 6 months, I believe, was after a global pandemic started. The fundraising for the organization was down, I think, approximately 50%. You were the first non-military, retired military person to head the organization. You have a totally different background as you were, I believe, a director of the Orthodox Union. You really are American. I'm not sure you even served in the Israel Defense Forces. So you brought a totally different perspective to the organization. And then you had to face the challenges once you got things up and running of what happened on October 7th. How did those two events affect your perspective on how you viewed and how you got the Friends of Israel Defense Forces together, and what changes did you have to make in the organization?
That's a challenging question. I'll say this, but we had a couple of challenges. One was we needed credibility with the American donor base. The second was the organization needed credibility with the Army and the Ministry of Defense. And one of the changes we made is that we consistently said, we're only going to take the most critical, urgent needs that come directly from the general staff. They do it through a general who oversees the Human Resources branch. All branches of the Army go through that Human Resources branch. And as well, when it comes to the Ministry of Defense, and the reason I use the two terms, the IDF and the MOD, the Army is from the day you draft till the day you're discharged. The Ministry of Defense, in the case of a wounded soldier, someone suffering from PTSD, a bereaved family, the Ministry of Defense is responsible for you the rest of your life. And we went to them and we made it very clear. We have you in our name. And instead of doing all these side deals with all these little organizations, where this general can give some money to his friend who was in his soldier, who was another general, etc., we're working straight through the system. The problem is many organizations in America, they go into Israel and they tell the Israelis what they need. We do it the opposite. And again, we use BDO as our forensic accountants. So everything we transfer, we have receipts for, and we see the budgets. But we say to them, what are your most critical and urgent needs? What do you need for the benefit of the soldiers that you don't have budget for? And that gained us incredible credibility. First of all, with the Army and the Ministry of Defense, which we have a very warm a very warm relationship with. And secondly, it also gave us credibility with foundations, with donors. Donors who had left the organizations, foundations that would never thought of giving to the IDF. Because when we go to them, we're going to them, literally with details in a very transparent way of budgets, of needs that are not there in the budgets, where the money is going, having our own forensic accountants, being able to show them the money trail. And then I'd say the second thing that we did, the nucleus of American Jewry, our number one, the Reformed, Conservative, and Orthodox congregations, federations, APAC. I mean, there are many different organizations, there are many different Jews. But I'm talking about the nucleus, the foundation that really gives of their soul, of their finances, of their resources for the benefit of the needs of the Jewish people. And one thing I noticed when I came, we didn't have that nucleus, that mainstream donor base as part of FIDF. And we needed to make the case to them that this is one of the most critical urgent needs. And why do I use that word, critical urgent needs? Because the average country on earth gives 2% of the GDP. That's what they invest in military and security. Israel before the war was investing 10.2% of the GDP into the IDF and Shabak, which is, I guess we would say the Shabak in our terms would be Homeland Security and the FBI, the security and defense of the country. Today, we don't have the exact numbers. It's somewhere around 17.5%. It's a miracle of biblical proportions that an economy can survive when 10.2%, or for that matter, today it's 17 something percent. There's no way an economy can survive that. And that's why we exist. And that's why we're necessary for the benefit of the soldiers, whether it's being the GI Bill, whether it's the welfare of the soldiers, the well-being of the soldiers. And we can go into the details later. And to make the case to the mainstream American Jewish community, of which we were irrelevant, to make the case to them that this is a critical need, and we need not only their financial support, we need them engaging with us. We need them backing us. We need them being pillars of who and what we are. And I think that's part of the way we've increased our donor base fourfold, and we've increased our revenue, 3.5-fold, because we've become relevant to that mainstream American Jewish community.
Have you seen since October 7th, the horrible events of October 7th? I would guess that probably helped your fundraising and helped your participation in the American community. Just as, frankly, that's the time that I got mostly involved. I would think that that's something that you found that to be across the board in the American Jewish community. Is that true?
Absolutely. And there were American Jews who just wanted to see if they could help fulfill a need. And then there was a second kind of American Jew that's fascinating. You and I would call them an October 7th Jew. They really had an epiphany. I mean, we have a couple of people working for us, incredibly talented people who left their world. I mean, to quote one of the people who's working with us, and I don't want to use a name because I don't have permission, she says, my religion was Black Lives Matter. And she said, what happened was the people who I invested and who I sacrificed for, the people that I committed to, turned on me. We're not talking about a year later. We're talking on October 9th. They turned on me. And people who I thought were my friends, I was naive and I was a fool. These were not my friends. These are people who used me. And she had an epiphany as a Jew. And she's not the only one. She's one of hundreds of thousands of Jews who understand that the naivete they had about where they stand in the world, where they stand amongst their fellow Americans and friends, is very different than what they perceived. So we've seen that vis-a-vis our donor base. We've seen that vis-a-vis the kind of quality of staff that we've been able to attract. And I don't think we're unique.
Now, I know that reading your bio that you weren't always right now you're Orthodox Jew and you're a rabbi, but you weren't always religious in your early years. You became religious in your teenage years, and you said you witnessed antisemitism, or you experienced antisemitism in that time. And I never experienced anti-Semitism until the events of what's happening on American campuses, and then the split where people are either pro-Israel, it seems to me, or anti-Israel. If they're anti-Israel, they also seem to become, they extend that to become anti-Semitic too with Americans here. And what's going on in the college campuses now, in which Jewish students, a lot of them just don't feel safe on American campuses. What's your opinion on how that should be dealt with in the United States? What's going on in all the campuses now?
See, my experience was unique. I don't think it's something you can translate into the campuses. We're German Jewish refugees.
Right.
We're very proud Jews, very committed Jews in the sense that we may not have observed everything, but it was a kosher home. We always had a Friday night dinner. Very charitable. I was a first generation American. Since we were the only Jews, my father raised my brother and myself. He says, you don't have to win. He says, but don't ever come home and tell me that you back down from a fight. Because if you don't fight the person who attacks you, who calls you names, they'll just take advantage of you. He says, you may not win the fight, but they'll respect you and they won't do it again. And he was right about that. So, I was suspended from school a number of times for fighting. Never a fight that I started on my own, but I never backed down. I won some, I lost some. So did my brother. But that was unique. And my father was right. Once you stand up to an anti-Semite, you stand up to a bully, they back down. They don't start up a second time. I'm not sure that what I experienced being the only Jew, my brother and I were the only Jews in our school. We were the only Jews in about a 45 mile radius. I'm not sure that's something that I can relate or translate to the college campuses. I will say
how would you
unfortunately the Jews do cower,
right.
and that's a mistake because predators, bullies, they only take advantage of that.
So how would you deal with, how do you think that American Jewry should deal with or take a position on what's going on at college campuses with all of the pro-Palestinian, pro-Gaza, pro-Hamas in many cases, demonstrations that's going on? What do you think American Jewry should be doing?
I'm not sure that I'm wise enough to answer that. I can tell you one case who happened to live here in Teaneck, New Jersey. When the supporters of the Palestinian rapists and the supporters of the Palestinian child murderers, when they felt that they were going to come into this as a Jewish town, it's like when the Nazis came to Skokie, Illinois. The rabbi said, ignore it, don't make a scene. And I understand why the rabbi said that. And what happened was they came and they were emboldened and they came back a second time. And the rabbis understood they made a mistake. And they convened the community and they asked the high school students to come, with their boom machines, etc. And the third time that the supporters of the Palestinian rapists and Palestinian child killers came, the pro-Hamas, the pro-Muslim Brotherhood activists, they were totally drowned out. The community outnumbered them. The community was louder than them. And you know what? They haven't come back because they walked away with their tail between their legs and they looked like a bunch of idiots. Now, I'm not here to tell you that that's a model. I haven't thought that out well enough. I can tell you that I have an incredible admiration for the rabbis who realized that their strategy and their plan day one here in this community, which was thought out, turned out to be wrong. And they changed. And the results changed.
So they had to stand up to the bullies.
Yeah.
That's basically what your childhood experience was, that we can't ignore it. Oh, let me ask you something.
I will say this. I think every Jewish girl and every Jewish boy that goes to a Jewish camp or a Jewish day school, those schools and those camps should be teaching these kids Krav Maga so they can defend themselves. They don't have to be afraid to walk with a Magen David or a Chai or a kippah on their head. They don't have to be afraid to walk around or to walk into a Jewish institution. They should have the confidence. I'm not saying that they should be vigilantes. I'm saying that they should at least have the confidence to defend themselves. And I'm not sure most of them were raised that way to be able to defend themselves. Because this is not pretty, what's going on. And the bullying on social media is not pretty. And unfortunately, most American kids, it's neurological. They have an addiction to the social media. They can't separate from it. And therefore, their whole self-worth and their whole self-esteem is a function of the kind of garbage that they're fed and the kind of pressure that they're under. And that's it's tragic. Parents, educators, we have to try our best to try to wean them from that. But as long as it exists, they have to be able to have the self-worth and self-respect to be able to see the world in different terms.
Now, in Israel, there are a lot of Jews who don't agree with the government's handling of this war. They want the focus to be more on just getting the hostages back. And I had lunch with the former Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, and I asked him the question, I'm an American Jew. I'm not in Israel. I'm not facing these issues. But I have an opinion, and maybe I don't always agree with everything that the government is doing. Is it appropriate for me, as a supporter of Israel, strong supporter of Israel, to say anything critical of the government, just like an Israeli citizen would exercise his rights to be critical of the government? And he basically told me no, that it's not the place for an American, in his opinion, an American Jew to do that. That's internal Israeli politics, and you shouldn't voice an opinion. You should just be supporting organizations like Defense of Israel Defense Forces and other APAC and other organizations to support Israel, and you should not get involved in the politics. What's your feeling about that?
So I have a daughter who's in the Israeli Air Force. I have a daughter who, unfortunately, one of her best friends was her roommate, was killed in this war. Another Israeli lone soldier, great kid from Atlanta, Georgia. My daughter is sacrificed. My daughter pays taxes there. My daughter, she's earned the right, so to speak, to be a decision maker, a voter, etc. I don't feel that I have. Sitting here, pompously criticizing or praising them either way, I don't think is my place. And if I really was that passionate about something, I can do that in a way where we go there and say, look, as an American Jew who's invested in Israel, I want to share with you a concern. But that can be conveyed in a private way. For us to sit and write op-eds here in America, for us to go on our soapbox, I don't think it's fair, because I don't think we've earned that right. Earning that right means you pay taxes there, you fought in the army, you've had to live in bomb shelters for the last 30 years of your life, which is what every Israeli's had to do. It just gives you a different perspective and a different context, and it makes your opinion a little more sophisticated, a little more wise than somebody who's pampered living in a suburb in the United States of America.
I had an experience. I have a foundation in the Herbert Citrin Charitable Foundation, and what we normally don't give to organizations that don't help people in the metropolitan area, I felt it was very important, and I'm the president of the foundation, to support the Friends of Israel Defense Forces. And I asked them to present, because I wanted to give them a grant. And indeed, we ended up giving you a grant. But I had one trustee who stood up and said, well, if we're giving to them, then we should be giving to the people in Gaza for humanitarian aid. And it was the first time I ever got angry in these meetings, because they were making some equivalency between the two. And I read statistics even today that the people in Gaza, 50% think that what Hamas did on October 7th was the right thing to do. I saw that statistic yesterday. So it got me upset. I had the people in your organization who were making the presentation, I warned them that there was one trustee that was not supportive. So they were prepared for it. But the American Jewish community is split. The traditional liberal wing, the that usually supports the left wing causes, which I'm not really a part of, but I understand that it is split, and its support for the state of Israel and support what's going on is difficult, and it's something that we have to address here, because I'm a little concerned that it used to be that support for the state of Israel was a bipartisan issue. Both Democrats and Republicans supported Israel absolutely. I think it would be a terrible thing if it became a political issue whether we should support Israel. And there are some, because of what's going on, that are pulling back from the support of Israel. And there's some, in my opinion, anti-Semites in Congress that are becoming anti-Israel. How do you feel about that, and how that should be dealt with?
Look, whether it's through the vehicle of AIPAC or whether it's other vehicles, I think the facts speak for themselves. 70%, it's probably more, but the lowest figure I've seen is that 70% of Gazans subscribe to the theology and the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't think a typical congressman understands what that means. The Muslim Brotherhood has been expelled from Saudi Arabia, expelled from the United Arab Emirates. It's illegal in Egypt. It's despised in every country on the globe, with the exception of Qatar, who's funding them, and Turkey, who Erdogan is funding them, whose ultimate goal, as he stated, is to establish a caliphate, a Turkish caliphate, of which he's the caliph, in which Al-Quds is part of that, meaning Jerusalem is part of his caliphate. So with the exception of the Qatarians and Erdogan, who's supporting the Muslim Brotherhood? It's their fellow Sunni Muslims hate them, despise them. They're fellow Sunni Muslims, and that's the fascinating thing. And we saw that happening, in the behind-the-scenes talk at the UN, what the Israeli ambassador, what the Israeli defense attaché were being told by Sunni Muslim nations that don't even have relations with Israel, that they view the Palestinian as the worst swine on earth. That's their terminology. Because how dare they take money from the heretical Shia? The Muslim Brotherhood, which first and foremost is a heretical sect of Sunnism, but it's that they would go to bed and take money from the Shia who despise them, who are trying to annihilate them, and do this to their fellow Sunnis. That's why the Palestinians are so despised. I'm not talking about what's said publicly. I'm talking about amongst the Arabs themselves and what they tell the Israelis behind the scenes. So what is the theology of the Muslim Brotherhood? And it's not a theoretical theology, it's an ideology in practice. That's what enables them to rape Jewish men, not just Jewish women. The amount of Jewish men that were raped on October 7th violently by they're not animals. An animal wouldn't do something like that. By these Palestinians. The destruction of children, the beheading of children, the burning alive of children, and they gloated and they called back. And I tell you, you've seen it, Howard. You've seen the videos. They're bragging to their mothers how many children they've burnt. Human beings don't do that. Not any human being with any sense of decency. But what enables them? This is that theology of the Muslim Brotherhood. They cannot tolerate a Christian. They can't tolerate a Jew, an infidel, to have any control of land that they deem as al-Islam. And it's not just Israel. It's Andalusia, it's Castile and Spain. It's the Balkan states, it's parts of France, it's Italy. This is who they are, this is their theology. And that's, by the way, why they are so despised by their fellow Muslims. Why they view the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood as the swine of the earth. I'm not talking about we don't, the Muslim world does. But do you think the average congressman has any sense of nuance? The difference in theology between Shia and Sunni, the difference in how they see the Quran, the different Sharia between Sunni and Shia. Do you think they have any clue of nuances within the Sunni world? I'm talking about United States senators and congressmen. They're blind to this. They're ignorant to it. And what they don't understand is, which is it's a Western problem. The arrogance in the Western world is we project ourselves onto others. The whole notion of separating church and state in Islam is heretical. It's evil. It's immoral. Because by definition, Islam defines government. It defines military. It defines control. It defines power. You don't separate religion from power. You don't separate religion from government. And by the way, that's the theology of Islam. I'm not attacking that. I'm saying that. And we have to respect Muslims, and we have to respect Islam for who and what they are, and not to project, these childish Western notions that we have onto them. It's ignorance and it's arrogance. And we have to do a better job just sharing them the basic facts of the nuance within the Sunnis, of the difference between the Sunnis and the Shia, of the hatred that exists between Muslim and Muslim over this. Because in the eyes of a Sunni Muslim, the heresy of the Shia, which is why they despise the Ayatollahs, the Imams, and the IRGC. And they understand that after 14 centuries of Sunni domination of Shia, this is the first time in history that even though the Shia are 100 million Muslims and the Sunnis are 1.45 billion Muslims, it's the first time in history that the Shia are dominant and that are oppressing the Sunni. And the Sunni are telling us, and they said this to the Biden administration, take the handcuffs off. I heard this with my own ears from Sunni nations that don't have relations with Israel. Take the handcuffs off the Yehud, off the Jew. Let the IDF, let the Israelis, they're defending us. You're too naive. They're defending you. They're defending you, Western civilization. They're defending you, the Christians. But for sure, they're defending us, the Sunni Muslims. Now, you have to understand what I said before. That's why they hate the Palestinians. They don't hate them. They refer to them as swine. That's which is a terrible, terrible derogatory term for a Muslim to say about another Muslim. That's what the Sunni Muslims tell me about the Palestinians. Because they, the Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they take money from the despised heretical Shia. They turn against their fellow Sunnis. But those kind of basic facts, I'm not sharing opinions, basic facts, the typical senator or congressman is just totally clueless to that. I don't expect them to have a PhD in Islam. I don't expect them to be masters of political science. But we have to do a better job of just sharing with them the facts. And by the way, the professors on the campus, they know this. They're scared to death to share this. They're scared to death to teach any of this, even though they know it, because it doesn't fit their ideology. So they take young, impressionable American minds and they poison them. Now, by the way, there's a reason why. The Muslim world has spent $13 billion on American campuses. The largest chunk of that are the Qatarians. Look, the Qatarians have bought everything. You take, what's it called? Brookfield Place, okay? One of the largest real estate holders in Manhattan. That's 30% owned by the sovereign wealth fund of the Qatarians. The Qatarians buy and sell everything in this country. And they've bought and sold the campuses. They control academia. Education is not education. Education is brainwashing and manipulation. And it's bought. It's bought by the Arab world. And we have to be honest and we have to acknowledge that.
But let me ask you something a little different that I've always felt. In American politics, there's always been the feeling that we should have a two-state solution in Israel. There should be an Arab state, a Jewish state. And I remember, I think it was Golda Meir that said a long time ago that we really can't have peace with the Arabs until they love their children more than they hate our children. I'm paraphrasing it. It's not exactly right, but that's and what it seems what October 7th to me demonstrates is that there can't be a two-state solution because the Arab state's going to be a terrorist base, and it's a terrorist base for several reasons. I think it's aside from the fact of the Brotherhood's theology, it's also a money thing. If you look at from Yasser Arafat to Senwar, all these people are billionaires or close to it or have hundreds of millions of dollars because they don't really care about what happens to the Palestinians or the people living in Gaza or the people living in the West Bank. They care about accumulating wealth themselves, and they've accumulated tremendous wealth themselves. So, and that they've taken that money and they haven't given it to them. They've kept it for themselves. And that's part of the problem, I think, aside from the theology. They've been selling this theology to the populace, who is poor and is getting very little, while the leaders of these organizations have profited that much. And until we can somehow get past that and get to a point where the other Arab countries are going to say, enough, we don't want this theology anymore. It's not helping us. It's not helping the people. I don't think a two-state solution is really something that's viable to pursue any longer. I think, in my opinion, the two-state solution for right now is dead. What do you think about that?
You have to contrast the Abraham Accords that took place on the one hand between the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, was joined by the Moroccans because of the deal with the Western Sahara. But look at the position of the Bahrainis and of the Emiratis. That was a real peace agreement. When Sadat signed the accords with Menachem Begin, what did he publicize? The Western press was totally ignorant of this. He said he got a decision from the highest level of imams, they have a theological university there in Cairo, that invoked what Muhammad did to the people of Medina, where first he made a deal with them, but he waited till his forces could gain enough strength. And he came back and he annihilated them and slaughtered them. It said, you're allowed to make peace with your enemy, and it's a theological idea. You're allowed to make peace with your enemy under deceptive terms until you're in a position when you can conquer the enemy. That was a decision that was determined on the highest theological level that enabled Sadat to do the peace accords. That's what Sadat he justified himself in front of the eyes of his Muslim population in Egypt. Arafat invoked that to the Palestinians. He always invoked that. We have recordings of that. So they would share that with Shimon Peres, Shimon Peres will never be accused of being a theologian or a historian. And he used to poo-poo it. He said, no, he's just saying that for public consumption. He doesn't really mean it. Well, Shimon Peres, history has proven him to be dead wrong. Okay, that's the problem with the two-state solution. When a priori, the people said, we're only doing this way we get 40% of the territory we want to conquer. And it's a first step until we're in a position when we can conquer the other 60% of the territory. That's not a peace agreement. That's the Jews, Israelis, wanting peace. And that's a deception and a manipulation on behalf not only of the leadership of the population of the Palestinian people, but of the populace. It's a theological deception that's rooted in the Quran, that's rooted in their prophet Muhammad. You and I view that as immoral. You and I view that as deceptive, as manipulation, as disgusting. But they don't. They don't view that. They view that as something. That's how you do business. That's how you gain a temporary state until you are in a better position down the road. They don't view that as something being bad or negative or immoral or unethical. So how do you have that's not the same as the Abraham Accords. That's not the attitude of the Emiratis. That's not the attitude of the Bahrainis. I mean, we've got to be honest amongst ourselves. We can't lie to ourselves. We have to listen to what they say to each other in Arabic. I listen, I'm watching the translations of the dialogue that the royal family has in Abu Dhabi to their population, that what the Bahraini government has to their population relative to what you hear from day one under Abbas's administration, under Arafat's administration, from the Palestinian leadership. And I mean, it's a very, very tenuous existence that we live with people whose ultimate goal is our eradication. And where do you see that more than anything else? The funding. Look at the salary of what a family gets for people who kill Jews. Look at the salary of what a public servant gets working for the PA. You'll see who their heroes, you see who they lord, you see who they admire. And the saddest thing is the PA is funding people that want them dead, who have killed them, the same group that killed them in Gaza, the Hamas. Okay, they're funding them. They're funding them a fortune of money to go and kill Jews. How do you do that if this is your sworn enemy? How do you fund Hamas murderers and butchers? You know, I happen to know Rabbi Leo D, how they slaughtered his daughters and they slaughtered his wife. And yet they get funded to the hilt. They make more than 95% in their fund. Those families of the murderers get funded more than 95% in salary of what a typical Palestinian makes. And that's by the PA. It's not by Hamas. The ones who control that and who fund that is the PA. And we call that a two-state solution? I mean, come on, are we naive? And again, I contrast it to a very different kind of peace that you saw in the Abraham Accords. It's a very different Islam coming out of the Emirates. It's a very different Islam, not necessarily amongst every Bahrani person, but the government of Bahrain. It's a different language of what they say to each other. It's a different attitude. It's a different perspective. That you can call peace.
I agree with you on those issues, but I feel I would be remiss if I didn't take this back to the FIDF, because I want my listeners to become supporters, if you haven't already, of that organization. So I'm going to ask you some things that when I go and try to get my friends and colleagues to support the FIDF, one of the things they say to me, well, why isn't the Israeli government paying for this? Why do we have to pay to support soldiers? I mean, the government here supports the soldiers and takes care of this. Why isn't it happening there? Why should we be supporting soldiers there? And what should we be?
It's a very fair question. It all goes back to what President Trump said to Angela Merkel and when his first term, and he said it to the French and the Italians. He says, why is the American taxpayer supporting first world rich nations? He says, we're there. We're going to be part of NATO. We're going to send our troops and we're going to send our funds. But you have to do your fair share. And that's in the conditions of the creation of NATO, which they'd never lived up to. What did he mean? He kept saying your fair share. He asked them to give 2%, 2% of the GDP. If Israel is spending 2% of the GDP on defense, you don't need an FIDF. But I got news for you. Right now, we're funding not just their full education, but their expenses. They need expenses for room and board, for books, for lunch money, for 4,200 former soldiers who come from either poverty or low middle class. We're the GI Bill. They don't have the funds for it. Not when they're spending 17% of the GDP. That the Israeli economy actually exists is a miracle. It's not a modern miracle. It's a miracle of historical proportions when they're spending 17% of the GDP on defense and security. Again, before the war, it was 10.2%, which is unheard of, when the international average is 2%. So that's why we're funding 50,000 soldiers that come from welfare. In Israel, there's two levels. There's tachat kav ha'oni, underneath the poverty level. That's called, in English, you call it deep poverty. And then there's something called tchum afor, the gray zone. So the first group, we have 10,000 soldiers. The other is 40,000 soldiers. 50,000 soldiers are coming from families that are in poverty. So with that, we're funding. Look, what Israel's dealing with now, we've committed right now about 118 million. It grows every month, but at this point, about 118 million, 119 million. The most tragic Israeli, for that matter, I think the most tragic American, is a Vietnam vet, is an Iraq or Afghanistan, a Persian Gulf II vet. In Israel, the most tragic Israeli is a Yom Kippur vet. 1973. Nobody knew from PTSD. They said, suck it up, Come on, you're a tough Israeli. Be a man and suck it up. Well, when your neurotransmitters go, you can't suck it up. It's neurological. It's biological. And what they're doing is incredible. Right now, the former head of mental health for the IDF Had a very storied career, Dr. Lauer. He's right now working at Walter Reed Hospital. He's working with the American VA because Israel's doing some incredible things that we're funding, whether it's the early detection, whether it's the embedding of mental health professionals in the battalions, whether it is we've funded already 400 mental health professionals who had no background in PTSD because there was a shortage. There weren't enough to go around. The MOD chose Dr. Mickey Pollack and his team at Sheba Hospital. They've trained, intense training, these 400 therapists, and they're managing them. So we're funding facilities all over the country. People are getting serious therapy with a dedicated therapist. Unfortunately, we're not doing this in the VA. And that's why the suicide rate, which is the most extreme, but if you go to less extremes, the depression, the anxiety, the dysfunction of our American vets, incredible young Americans who sacrificed in Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't want to have a repeat of that. And America's actually observing and watching what Israel's doing with the soldiers of this war. And I mean, I can go into further details. But another example, we've committed over $28 million for bereaved families. Okay? There's 310 brand new widows. There's 715 brand new orphans. There are 3,100 kids who've lost an older brother, older sister in this war. And part of what we're doing is financial support for 300 of these 850 families who have lost a loved one. 300 are in a very vulnerable place financially, above and beyond what the government gives them, okay? And the government is generous, but above and beyond what the government gives them, they're in a vulnerable place. So we're funding them. But it's more than that. It's you use the analogy of the survivors. I happen to be, a child of survivors. So you see, survivors were only really safe. They only really felt comfortable when they were amongst other survivors who'd been through a similar thing. There's certain experiences, there's certain emotions, there's certain ghosts that haunt you that you cannot expose. Those are raw, naked, very, very fragile emotions. You can't expose them to someone else, to an outsider. You can only really feel safe amongst someone who's been through where you've been. And the same thing is true of these orphans. The same thing is true of these bereaved families. So we fund all of these retreats, widows in their 20s and 30s, Drew's parents who buried a son, all the micro demographics of the bereaved families. And the goal of all of these programs, above and beyond the therapy, the primary goal is that they have a network amongst themselves, that they can create. We're bringing 750 orphans here this summer, okay? That they can create a network amongst themselves. I apologize when I use the word orphans. It's not just orphans. It's also siblings who've lost an older brother or an older sister. Over half of them have lost a parent. The other half have lost an older sibling. But the point is, they can say certain things, and I can give you specific stories from this past summer. They can say certain things amongst each other they can't say to someone else. And what's fascinating about these programs, the advisors, the counselors, they themselves are also bereaved. In other words, instead of it being somebody who's just a great counselor, no, the counselors themselves lost a father or lost a brother or lost a sister at war. And you see the cathartic transformational experience these things have. The government doesn't have money for this kind of stuff. And I understand why the government doesn't have money for this, because they're not spending 2% of the GDP. They're spending 17% of the GDP. And that's why you and I, American Christians, American Jews, people who understand that these young men and young women, they're not at the forefront of defending Israel. Of course they are. They're at the forefront of defending Western civilization. When the Supreme Ayatollah, when the IRGC keeps using this term, the Great Satan, they're not just referring to America. America is the poster child of the Great Satan. They mean Christianity. They mean Western civilization. The Jews are standing in their way, preventing them from having a Shia Islamic caliphate from the Arabian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. The Jews are the only ones standing in their way, the IDF. But the IDF is also what's standing in their way of not only conquering Sunni Islam, but the second phase, the ultimate phase, is Christianity. It's Western civilization. So we're trying to help these young people who've sacrificed their innocence, sacrificed their youth, who've shown incredible, incredible sacrifice. and done it in such a, and if we have a few minutes, why is this the most ethical, moral war in history? When you're dealing with an enemy that dresses amongst civilians, dresses like a civilian, uses human shields, what's called asymmetric warfare, the average is it's called collateral damage. 9 civilians are killed for every 1 combatant. Just to use an example, our American forces, which are it's an incredibly moral army, when they killed American contractors in Fallujah, we sent in the 101st Airborne, we sent in the Marines. We conquered Fallujah at a rate of 23-1. 23 civilians were killed for every 1 combatant. Mosul was 30-1. And we're talking about an ethical army, the US Army, the British Army. Take a look at what's happened in Gaza. And I'm using UN numbers, and the UN is by no way, shape, or form would you call philo-Israeli, would you call sympathetic to Israel? 1.1 to 1. I don't believe those numbers. I believe the numbers are closer to 0.8 to 1. But the UN numbers of deaths of combatants versus death of civilians as a function of the IDF, it's 1.1. And there's never, ever been a war in such a densely populated area in history. I'm talking about where the majority of the war is taking place in a densely populated area. And it's 1-to-1 when the statistics are 9-to-1. The historical statistics we have are 9-to-1. Okay? Israel's off the charts. And on top of that, you're talking about an enemy that won't allow the civilian population to leave, that uses human shields, that works out of hospitals, that works out of mosques, that works out of kindergartens. That's who the enemy is. There's no more ethical, moral battle in history. The integrity and morality of these kids, of these young men and women who we call the IDF, is just outstanding.
Well, I feel personally that it's an obligation of every Jew, and I think Christians also, to be supportive of the Friends of Israel Defense Forces. You know, I didn't get into. I always look when I'm looking to support a charity. I look at Charity Navigator, and they have the highest rating, which means that when you're contributing, you know the money's going for that purpose. It's not going into someone's pocket. They have a very small overhead expense compared to what they're raising, and it's just a terrific organization. And I am so proud for the small part that I'm playing in it, and I hope to be able to do more. And Steve, Rabbi Weil, I want to thank you for being on the mark, and I wish you the best in your future endeavors. And I hope to see you. I think there's a June 17 event I'm coming to in Manhattan. I hope to get to meet you in person there. I don't think we've ever met in person, but if you're there, I'll be sure to come over and say hello. Thank you for being on the mark. And good wishes.
Howard, thank you very much. It's a real honor. And the reality is we have a very long war. It's going to be a longer war. And I can't thank you enough. And I can't thank, the 80,000 families throughout the United States and the Jews, Christians who are supporting these young men and young women. We're very, very grateful. And also, thank you for acknowledging. I think there may be 1.5% of all American charities that have what we have, the highest rating from Charity Navigator 13 years straight. And what's even more difficult is to get the rating from the foundation. We have the platinum rating from the foundation. And we're very proud of that. And again, we do pay salaries. We pay very decent salaries for people who produce, for people who look after the soldiers. And we try to keep our overhead to as very minimal as possible. But we thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of On the Mark. I started this podcast by quoting John F. Kennedy and would like to end it with quoting one of my favorite baseball players, Nolan Ryan. Enjoying success requires the ability to adapt. Only by being open to change will you have a true opportunity to get the most from your talent. I wish you success in staying ahead of the curve instead of behind the 8 ball. Thank you for tuning in.